today, as I mentioned before, we're going to go over some stuff about how to set up your outliner in a way to make camera motion easier and or more realistic. Before we do that, I just want to go over really quick, just like a weird good tidbit to be aware of. Does anybody know the difference between world space and local space in Maya? All right. So it's kind of not necessarily relevant a lot of the times, but like good to know that it exists. So world space is basically, let me just open my outliner real quick. When the object is being measured, the distance it is away from the origin. So right now, like if I move the cylinder around, ooh, hello, you can see that whatever these translate values are is basically, again, the distance from the origin. If I zero these out, it's going to snap it back to the origin, basically saying put no distance between this, and this is just where I am. So that's world space. And that is pretty much how all of the objects operate pretty much all of the time, unless you parent them together. So if I were to take this sphere, and I'm going to just parent this under the cylinder. So you can see now in my outliner, it's under the cylinder. If you look at it now, this actually, I've not moved it off the origin at all, but it does have some different values in the translate boxes. Basically what this is doing is it's actually measuring the distance away from the parent object, in this case the cylinder, instead of the origin. So this is what happens pretty much whenever you parent objects together. Again, just something kind of good to be aware of. You can, in most circumstances, do something where, like, if I zero this out now, it's actually going to snap into the center of the cylinder. So if you are ever looking to, like, kind of line stuff up like this, you want to make sure that something's in the same position as something else. You can just parent it, zero out the values. The object should snap into the same position as the parent. And then what you can do is go ahead and Shift P to unparent your object. And it's still going to stay in the same position that it was when you snapped it into the location of the parent. And you'll notice that it's actually acquired, it's pretty much the same values for translation as the cylinder. But it's now separate, and you can like move this around. It's once again entered world space since it's no longer parented. But yeah, that's pretty much world versus local space. Does anybody have any questions about that? Kind of just like a weird side note. Most of the time, I kind of ignore this unless I want to center an object on another one, in which case, again, I'll just parent them, zero out these values, and then it'll just snap the object into place. So that's my first like hardcore random demo of the day. The other thing that I really want to go over really fast is just making a quote-unquote rig, kind of similar to that we used for the bouncing ball assignment, where it's basically just a camera with a bunch of groups on it that you can use to move a camera in a sort of more realistic, real-world kind of way. So if I just really quick go through and I just make a new camera. And again, if any of you guys have any questions about what I'm doing as I'm doing it, feel free to just stop me and let me know. So I'm just going to grab this camera and I'm going to group it 4 times. So if I look at my outliner, it is now nested under 4 different groups. And I'm going to do pretty much the same thing, again, that I did with the bouncing ball. I'm going to just isolate each one of these groups for a specific type of movement. So in this case, the first one is just going to be like the move group. So if I need to shift the camera around through space at all, move it from, like just shift it over to 100 units left to start the animation, I'm going to use that move group there. The other group that I usually would do next is side-to-side motion. So that's going to be if your camera needs to, again, shift back and forth like this, kind of left to right. You can also create a group for pans. And this is going to be, I really can't type and talk at the same time, like at all. But this is going to be like up and down panning. So if your camera needs to go like vertically for some reason. And then the last group is going to be tilt. So this would be anything where your camera basically needs to rotate around. I usually use tilt for like any kind of rotation. You could isolate another group if you wanted to and have one just for side-to-side motion and just for up and down motion. again, it all kind of depends on what you need out of this fake little rig. And then if you wanted to, you could also go through and constrain, or you can lock any of the values for like rotate, etc. on any of the groups. So like for move, I don't really need rotation or scale. So I'm just going to go through and lock those. Side to side, you can actually get really, really aggressive with that and say, well, I only need translation on the apparently X axis, so I'm going to lock literally everything else. And then the up-down, like I would only need translate Y. So again, I'm just going to go through and lock literally everything else. So this is a good way. It's not something I do personally very often because I also usually don't do animated camera moves. But it's good in the sense that it allows you to basically treat your camera as if it's on a camera track, or like, again, if you're doing something in a actual film, a lot of times for pans or something, they'll have like a built-in track on the floor, and it kind of is good for like recreating that sort of more limited motion. So just setting up something like this can give you more obvious control over like the individual frames of the camera, but also help you sort of recreate a more real-world camera look. And this would be good also if you're doing something where it's like you're trying to match pre-existing VFX film, if that camera was on some kind of track, and you could get information like the length of that track, etc., and like details about how the camera was panning. This would allow you to input that and match the camera moves pretty easily. Yeah, so that's that. Anybody have any questions about that? All right. So again, you can add as many groups as this you need. Like I could have broken down tilt into side to side or up and down if I wanted to. It just depends on the functionality you need. And usually, so you can still click and move the individual camera while it's set up like this. If you want to ensure that you can't do that, just lock all the values for it. And that way it kind of forces you to use this, which I'm really bad about not locking these. Then I'll start animating the actual camera and realize like, oops, I haven't been using these groups at all. And now I need to basically undo all of this animation, which is always annoying. But it is, again, a little bit more realistic or sort of like real world feeling than doing something where you're just sort of moving the camera arbitrarily through space. Because a lot of times you don't have, like, it creates some like really strange, unrealistic camera moves. Like you can see at this point, the camera is sort of like tilted funny, but like it's also, you don't really have a lot of control over like the way it's moving when you do this. So setting up a little fake camera grouping rig like this could just be a little bit of an easier way to deal with the movements of your camera. It also, again, kind of helps things to feel less animated. It's kind of like hard to describe, but it's if you ever just like look at something, you're like, wow, that feels like a really animated object or like a really animated camera. A lot of times, like doing this can sort of help prevent that. Anywho, other questions on this, or any questions? All right. So today is a bunch of like little mini tutorials about things. So the next thing I wanted to go over really quickly is constraints, which are basically kind of like the heart of rigging, kind of, but they're also useful for other things. And there's a few differences between constraining objects and parenting objects. So for one, when you constrain an object, wait for it. All right. So when you constrain an object, it doesn't enter local space. It'll still stay in world space, but it will either follow like the translation or the rotation of the basically driver object, whatever object you set to control its movement. So first of all, actually setting up constraints. You can access, they're not in the modeling menu, but they are in both the rigging and animation. So I'm just going to go into my rigging menu, and you'll see that there is a tab at the top for constraints. If you click it, pretty much most of the stuff down here I've not played with, but like honestly, I want to, but usually the ones that you're going to want to use for this class are going to be any of these top ones up here. So does anybody know what any of these different types of constraints are? All right. No problem. I feel like feel like this is the first class where anyone actually goes over constraints. So I feel like the most obvious one is going to be scale. So scale is going to constrain the scale of one object to another. So in this case, when setting up a constraint, you want to select the driver object, so the object that you want to control the other object, and then the object that you want controlled second. Then go to constrain and just hit scale. So you'll notice if I look at the sphere, it's basically added these little bars as if it would if I'd locked the attributes, saying effectively, hey, these are tied to something else, you can't change these. I did notice the other day it was doing something weird where it still kind of let me scale this, but I've literally never seen it do that before. So I usually just, once something's constrained, I usually assume I won't touch these particular values for that object. But if you look at the cylinder and I change the scale on this, you'll notice that it's also changing the scale on the sphere because of that constraint that I set up. So again, this works on pretty much all axes, etc. And you'll actually notice if I look under my sphere in the outliner, there's a little node for that scale constraint. So if I decide that, like, hey, I actually don't want this constraint here, it's either broken or just not what I need, you can literally just find that node in your outliner and just delete it, and then the constraint's gone. So if I scale this now, you can see the sphere is just hanging out in the original size that it was. So I'm going to go through setting up constraints again, but any initial questions on any of that? All right. So other types of constraints are going to be orient constraints. So again, select your driver object, and then the object that you want to be modified, constrain, and orient. So orient constraints are for rotation. So now if I grab the cylinder, I can rotate the sphere. And you'll see that the sphere is actually, again, rotating along with this cylinder. So I feel like those are probably like the two kind of most explicit constraints. You'll also notice that if I move this around, the sphere still stays where it was, but I can, again, any modifications to the rotation is going to transfer, but nothing else will. So that's an orient constraint. The other type of constraint is a point constraint, and that is for, anyone have any guesses? All right. Point constraints are for translation. So I'm just going to go ahead and, again, select. OK, yes, cool. I was hoping that one of these would be set up in such a way. So you'll notice in this case, when I go in and I made that constraint, this point constraint, it snapped my circle into my cylinder. You can see they're still separate in the outliner. What am I saying? The sphere has just shifted into the cylinder. But again, it's not like parented to it. But if I move the cylinder around, it's also going to take the sphere with it because it is, again, constraining the translation values. In this case, assuming that you maybe don't want like the sphere to magically morph into your cylinder, you want it to stay separated, you can actually go in, and this setting applies to pretty much all of the other constraints. But if I go into the settings for this point constraint, you'll notice that there is a box for maintain offset. With this turned off, it's basically going to snap the rotation or the translation or whatever you're constraining to the driver object. If I turn this on and hit apply, you can see that it's made the constraint as normal, but it's also left my sphere where it was, and it's not moved it into the middle of the cylinder. So now if I move this around, you can see, again, it follows it as normal. It's just the sphere maintains this set distance from the object. So if you are so inclined, you can actually apply multiple constraints to the same object. So if I also wanted to do a constraint for rotation, I could go in and, again, if I wanted to, I could check the maintain offset button, and then I could apply that, and you can see that now it's going to follow both the translation and the rotation of the object. And then I'm like, oops, I did stupid settings for my orient constraint. Just go into your outliner, find it, and delete it. So really quick, I want to show you just what happens. Again, just a different flavor of maintain offset. But I'm going to pre-rotate this cylinder and uncheck maintain offset, select my sphere, and hit apply. And you can see that the sphere basically just snap to whatever rotation that cylinder was at. And again, that's just because of the maintain offset button. So I'm just going to undo that really quick. And you'll see that if in this case, I'll turn on maintain offset. So my cylinder starts out rotated. My sphere is straight up and down. I'll apply that. And you can see that the sphere has not changed rotation at all. It is still bound to this. So if I rotate this, it's going to also rotate the sphere. It's just not going to like snap it to that initial rotation of the cylinder. Does that make sense? All right. I'm going to assume that that's a yes unless I hear otherwise. All right, so that is pretty much all of the sort of like super basic types of constraints. There is also, if you ever need, so like I just put a point constraint and an orient constraint on this. There is another type of constraint that functions as like both built into one, and that is the parent constraint. So if I open this up, you can see, again, has the option for maintain offset if you want it. And it works on both the translate and the rotate values. So I'm just going to go ahead and apply that. You can see, again, we have a parent constraint, shows up in the outliner. And if I, hello. So if I rotate this, the rotation works a little bit differently from a standard orient constraint. So in this case, instead of just like rotating it in place, it's going to sort of drag it through space and keep that uniform distance away from the original object. But I can also, again, translate this. Pretty much that doesn't really change the way that works. So again, depending on the type of functionality you want, it might make more sense to set up a separate orient constraint or to just use a parent constraint. But they're pretty much otherwise like more or less the same. Other things to be aware of, and again, this works for more than just the parent constraint. You can turn on different, like you can select different axes for this to constrain. So if I decided, okay, I don't actually want all the translates constrained, I only want, say, translate Y, uncheck this all box next to translate and just select the axes that you want to constrain. So in this case, I'm just going to say all rotation and only the translate Y, hit apply, and you'll notice if you look at your sphere, it has not sort of added that little blue box next to the translate X or translate Z. It's only done the Y, again, in accordance with these settings. So that means I can basically move this, I can move this up and down, but if I move it left or right, this is going to stay where it is. So you can do that, again, pretty much with anything. You can also, if you're so inclined, basically set a parent constraint up to be kind of like a fill-in for an orient constraint. Or a point constraint. So if I, again, grab driver, grab driven, if I wanted this to just not have any kind of translate values at all, just uncheck all of these boxes and leave rotation checked, and it's still technically a parent constraint, but it's going to behave basically like an orient constraint. And if you actually turn off the translate values, it does behave just like an orient constraint where it's rotating the objects in place rather than like slinging the circle around the cylinder. Same thing goes for point constraint. And a lot of times, so like, if y'all haven't realized by now, mine's a little dodgy sometimes. So if you're ever like doing something and an orient constraint is just broken for no apparent reason, or your parent constraint is broken for no apparent reason, you can just, again, set it up with, like, use this parent constraint to sort of substitute the orient constraint, or you can use a point and an orient constraint in place of a parent constraint. And I have to do that a lot with rigging because stuff randomly breaks, and it's just like a whole weird Maya being insane thing. That's basically that. Any questions on that so far? All right. There is one other type of constraint, which is super fun and delightful and a little bit too fun to play with, and that is an aim constraint. So I'm just actually going to set up like a really ugly eyeball model real quick. It's going to be horrific. But this is like easily one of the most fun things to play with ever, I think. All right, so you get some real weird effects. All right, so I'm just going to grab these and be like, all right, here's my sad eyeball. And I'm just going to add a casual cube on top of this and say this is my eyeball controller. So again, great for stuff like if you have a pointing finger, you could make, a crowd of little people, have all of their heads follow something going through the air like a UFO. Also just good for normal eyeballs. So again, grab your driver object and then shift select your driven object and go to Constraint and Aim. Okay. And in this case, it's done something real weird. It's kind of like snapped the eyeball to the side. And I'm not gonna lie, I've literally never had these issues until I tried to use these on these computers. There's easy ways to fix that. So if you look at, and it's kind of weird, if you look at aim vector, and this is probably going to come up with the motion path as well, I imagine, but right now this is saying basically weight the entire aim vector on the x-axis, so this is like x, y, and z, which is saying I want the x-axis pointing up at this sphere, or at this cube. In this case, my eyeball is facing vertically. Oh, that's why I never have that issue. My eyeball is facing vertically, so I would like the y-axis to point at this cube instead of the x, if that makes sense. So I'm just going to set the aim vector for x to 0 and the y to 1, and then hit apply. And you can see that it's now this sad eyeball is actually pointing at the cube instead of off into who knows where. So if I move this around, you can see that the eyeball is basically following it. So again, really good for turning heads, actual eyeballs, etc. If you decide, and I usually, actually, so any questions on this? All right. So usually if I'm doing aim constraints, I have a personal preference to do maintain offset, so that way this eyeball doesn't snap to the center of my sphere, or my cube, because I find, I don't know, I always end up aligning these wrong and then end up with like weird eyes like bugging out in different directions. So I'm going to turn on maintain offset, and you can see the eye stays pointed straight. And I'll do the same thing for the other eyeball. So again, I'm just going to leave maintain offset on, and now if I move this, I have two eyeballs that sort of move through space and follow this cube. So they're pretty handy, aim constraints, and you can also do, so like for an eyeball rig, a lot of times what people will do is, where's the constraint on this? They'll set up sort of one little controller for each eyeball, and then in this case, I'm just going to throw these into a group. They'll set up like another controller so they can move both at once. So again, for an eyeball, I'm just going to grab the driver and the driven, hit apply, and do the same thing for the other eyeball. So now I actually have individual control over both of these eyes. And if I need to move both at the same time, I can just grab the group and translate that around, and it'll drag both eyeballs with it. So again, this would be good if you wanted something like extra functionality, or you had like a character doing a crazy face. You could like roll the eyes up and then like cross them aggressively, or something weird. Playing with eyeballs is among one of the most entertaining things to do to a rig, in my opinion. But that's pretty much an aim constraint. I'll go over like some other uses for that a little bit later when we go into motion paths. But any questions on that so far? All right. So that's basically constraints. I wanted to show you another thing you can do. So you can actually, my sad eyeball. So you can actually assign multiple objects to drive another object. So I just want to really quick show you guys how that actually works. And then I'll show you a practical example of like how to make an animation of something like picking up a ball or something like that. And it's going to be real janky, but it sort of like good flavor of like how you can use constraints. So I'm going to assume that I want this torus and this cylinder to drive this sphere. So in this case, I'm just going to select in no particular order the objects I want to control the sphere, and then shift select the sphere itself. So whatever the last object you select is the one that's going to be driven by the other objects. And then I'm going to do the same thing that I did before. I'm just going to go up and do a constraint, and I'll do a parent constraint with, I use maintain offset. So you can see that, again, the sphere now has a parent constraint under it. If I move the cylinder, oh, wait. Oh, yes, I see, good. So remember when I was like, yeah, if your constraint doesn't behave the way that you expected, in this case, it's not moving my circle at all. I'm just going to go ahead and delete that. And basically what happened when I set that up is I am fairly certain that I forgot to turn on translation. So it's only doing rotation. I want both. So I'm just going to check on translation again, reapply that. And now if I move this, you can see that it is taking the sphere with it as it did previously. Except this time you'll notice that it's not like a one-to-one motion. There's a little bit of sort of lag in the sphere. And that is because it is also being controlled by this torus. And there's a way that you can go in and sort of control that to basically weight the object differently if you need to. So if you need it for 1 second to follow the torus and not the cylinder, you can play with that. If you select the parent constraint itself, and then you go over and you look in your channel box. So you'll see there's like a bunch of weird stuff, which to be honest, I have never touched any of these like really long things. What you want to look for is these things that are like W0, W1. This is basically the weight or how much the object is going to follow that individual object. So you can see we have the torus and the cylinder there. And this is set up a little bit strange in my opinion. So this is not any kind of, like when I think of this, I think of, okay, we have two objects right now, they're each affecting the object like 50% of the translation, or like two objects, you have like all the weight divided by 2 is 50%, if that makes sense. For some reason, this is just sort of set up by whichever one's greater. So right now, if I make the cylinder value like 4,000, you can see the object snaps over and goes closer to the cylinder. So if I move it, it's following the cylinder pretty closely, but I can also still grab this torus. And it's super, super hard to see, but like the circle is still barely moving a teeny tiny bit. So it's a little bit weird. Like, I'm gonna make this 400, it'll be a little easier to see. So you can see it's like, it's kind of nudging the sphere around a bit. So this is like, I don't know how the heck they're calculating this, but personally, I usually just sort of like to set everything to values of some like multiple of, or like, what am I saying? I'm imagining that like it's divided by 1. So there's like a weight, there's like 1 unit's worth of weight, and each of these are taking 50% of it. So I'm gonna do like 0.5, or sometimes I'll go and do like 10, so they would each have weights of 5. Again, functionally, it doesn't matter in the slightest if your values are 0.5 and 0.5, 1 and 1, 7,000 and 7,000. It's just like kind of the weird way that Maya sets this up. And just kind of do whatever's easier for you to understand, if that makes sense. But what you can do if you want is say, I'm going to completely turn off the torus weight so that your torus will actually not move that sphere at all. And your sphere is going to basically behave like a normal parent constraint to a single object, and it's just going to move that cylinder with all of the weight. Does that make sense? All right. Kind of a weird explanation there, but yeah. So you can play with your weights this way. And you can use this, again, like this sort of multiple groups to set up a hand, like picking something up off a counter or something like that. And then the object, instead of having to manually grab it and move it with the hand, it just sort of follows the hand automatically. It's really good for stuff like cups of coffee, like balls, other things. So I'm going to show you guys how to set that up really quick. And I'm going to make just like a really, really dodgy arm rig. It's going to be ugly. All right. And by ugly, I mean I'm probably just going to use like a cylinder. Here is my sad arm rig. I'm going to just really quick grab the pivot and just shift that to the top so that I can sort of move it in an arc. As per A, it's a little bit easier to animate, and B, it kind of fits with the 12 principles of animation, like one of them is arcs. So I'm going to just go ahead and sort of shift that down here. And I'm going to just keyframe all of that and say maybe on frame 20, have it go down and hit this ball as if it's picking it up, and then just sort of move back up into the air. Very rapidly, apparently. So we have this sort of motion. Basically what we're going to do is make the ball follow the cylinder once the cylinder makes contact with it. So what I'm going to do is I want to be able to turn off the constraint in a sort of smooth transition. So really quick, you can also, I'm just going to constrain this to only this little original cylinder really quick. So cylinder, sphere for the driven object, and I'm just going to do a regular parent constraint. So again, moves around normally, same with rotation. You'll notice that you can also go in and edit the weight of the cylinder for just this cylinder. So I'm just going to key this at a weight of 1, and then I will go through and just turn that off entirely at a few frames later, and I'm just going to key this so it's doing some kind of motion, sort of randomly. All right. So you'll notice that as I scrub through this, so my cylinder is moving, and then if I look at my constraint on frame 50, the weight is set to 0. Right before frame 50, it's like 0.005, and you can see that it's still following that cylinder as normal. And then as soon as it hits frame 50 or that weight goes to 0, it just snaps back to the original position at the origin. So if you want to get sort of like a smooth transition between that, so it's not just like, you know, snapping aggressively from one place to the other, my sort of weird workaround is adding an extra group that also controls this sphere. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete this parent constraint real quick. With nothing selected, I'm just going to do Control G, and you'll see that just makes an empty group. I like how I've just named the null group. Anyway, so basically the same thing I'm going to do before where I had the torus in the cylinder. I'm going to grab my null group, grab my other cylinder, and then the sphere that I want to be controlled, and just do a parent constraint. And in this case, you'll see that, again, we have this weight for this little null group here. And if we shift that just empty group around, it's still going to move your sphere. So what we can do is go through, in this case, and I'm going to go ahead and just set the group weight to 0. It's going to start at frame 1. And I'm going to, so group doesn't affect the object at all, and then the cylinder starts affecting it, or is fully controlling it, basically. So I'm going to key those, go to, say, frame 30, and then swap the values. So the group is controlling the sphere entirely, and the cylinder is doing nothing to it. And then I'm going to key those values. Huzzah. So what we have, and it's a little bit like kind of quirky. So you can see that when it first starts, the object is barely moving at all because I'm not animating the null group. That's still just sort of hanging out at the origin. And as we go further down, the cylinder weight, oh no, sorry. Whoop, sorry. All right, so it starts out constrained to the cylinder. So as that's moving, you can see that it's sort of like very, very slowly as the cylinder starts moving. It's moving with the cylinder, and then at some point the weight of the group is pretty much overwhelming the weight of the cylinder. So it starts actually moving back towards where it was originally, since we had maintain offset turned on. So you can use this to get a little bit, it's kind of like a weird example, but you can use this to get some smoother transitions, so it's not just clipping aggressive, or like snapping from point A to point B, with that extra little null group sort of controlling the sphere, if that makes sense. So I'll demo this again with the arm, and it'll be like a little bit more of a tangible example, but are there any questions on that? All right. So I'm just gonna go ahead and delete all of these things. And I'll leave the goofy group I've just created. All right, so my ball's in the origin. I want to grab the cylinder, my fake arm, again, this empty null group, and then my sphere, and I'm going to go constrain and parent. And I'll do maintain offset. So in this case, what I usually like to do is, if this ball is sort of sitting there stationary, I will put this group in the center of the ball, so that if it ends up snapping back to somewhere, it'll snap back to basically where it was originally, if that makes sense. There's like a bunch of different flavors of like ways to do this and like subtle variations on it. It kind of is just like one of those weird things where it's like, play with it a little bit until you get what you need. A lot of times rigging is just sort of like that. But again, here's one flavor of this. So you can see originally, I see I've keyed the visibility on. Anyway, all right, so you can see as we start going, the arm is sort of controlling half the weight of this in general, which is like completely ridiculous looking and very much not what we want. So I'm going to go through and I'm just going to, again, grab the parent constraint and I'm just going to set the weight of the cylinder to 0 and figure out at what point, so I'm going to say maybe frame, it looks like 13. This is sort of making contact with my little ball. So I'm going to go ahead and just key the weights of these, the parent constraint on the cylinder and the empty group I made at frame 13. And I'm going to also key them at frame 12 with pretty much the same values. So basically what I'm doing is going and saying the frame before this little arm makes contact, I want the ball to not be moved by the arm at all. And then I'm going to go ahead on frame 13 and swap out these values so that the arm is now theoretically grabbing this ball. It's entirely being controlled by that arm, and the group 1 is not controlling it at all. So I'm going to go ahead and then just key selected for that. And you can see it's doing like kind of a dumb thing where it, in this case, is snapping away from the arm. And that is some horrible flavor of maintain offset being turned on. So basically, here it's actually just hanging out, again, on the origin where the group is. And then once I turn that weight off, it's like, oh, but I should be this distance away from the cylinder, right? And it's kind of convoluted and kind of silly. There's a few different ways around this. So one would actually be to put this sphere in a group and actually constrain the group instead of the sphere. So I'm actually really curious to see. Interesting, it does work. I've never just tried to shift a constraint like that, but it does seem to function. So at this point, what I could do is grab my sphere, just key all the attributes, and then just do like kind of a wonky thing at frame. Oh, that's beautiful. Oh, okay. No, so that actually doesn't work. All right. So I deleted my constraint entirely because I broke it. Constraints are a little bit weird. So I'm just going to set up the same thing I did again. So grab my cylinder, grab my null group, and then grab that, instead of the sphere itself, grab the group holding the sphere. And then again, set up a just parent constraint. And then this time, I should be able to go to frame 12 and key the cylinder weight at 0. Erg. And then again, at frame 13, swap it just like I did before. So this has, on the surface, basically the same effect where the sphere is like suddenly snapping through space to a different point in time. But what I'm able to do now is grab the sphere itself, and then this is like not a super elegant way to do things, but I can snap it back and like try to line it up with where it was previously and key those values. So there's just like a tiny little blip because I did a bad job lining it up. But there's just like a little bitty blip, and then the little arm kind of grabs it and then carries it off into the Maya void. So that's sort of one way to do things. There's a bunch of different ways to sort of avoid that snapping, many of which are fairly inelegant. The thing that I usually sort of like doing the most-ish is, and it's like a little bit convoluted. Basically, I'm going to make another group and, oh god, wait, let me get rid of the keyframes on this really quick, because that's awful. So I'm going to actually turn off maintain offset entirely when I make this constraint, and I'm going to keep my null group, which is currently in the center of that sphere, and then I'm going to make another random null group and move that, imagine like on frame 13. I'm actually just going to leave that at the origin since that's still at the center of the sphere. And then I'm going to take that group and I'm going to parent it under this arm. So what happens is you now have this cylinder that is moving around, and it has this weird extra group in it that's the center of the sphere. So it's, again, a little bit convoluted, but what I can do now is go through and select the null group that's attached to the arm, the null group that's just in the center of the sphere, and then the sphere itself. Go to Constraint, Parent, turn off Maintain Offset, and hit Apply. So now, theoretically, once I grab, when I key the constraint, so again, I'm just going to go frame 12. All right, so apparently null is the one on the arm. I should have labeled these better. I'm going to key both of these and then do the same thing on frame 13, where I swap the values, key them again. And you can see there's a snap in the rotation of the object, but in this case, it pretty much is staying stationary. So you could twiddle a little bit to get the rotation to stay the way it was, or in this case, I would probably just add another group on top of the sphere so I could just key the rotation of that. But you can see that now it sort of behaves in a more believable fashion. And basically what I've done here, by turning Maintain Offset off, so whenever I swap these values, it's going to snap directly to the center of the other object, which is why I left this little group in the arm in the center of the ball. So if I moved it like somewhere that wasn't the center of the ball would end up snapping to a different point in space, which isn't what I wanted. So again, there's like 800 different ways to do stuff depending on the functionality you need. You just kind of need to like think about what you need and like set something up, and if it's not behaving in the way you expect, think about why it's not behaving that way and then other ways to fix it, which a lot of times just involves a lot of weird extra null groups and stuff like that in your scene. So that was kind of like higher level awkward constraint stuff, but does anybody have any questions about any of that? All right. Cool. So that is great. All right. That is pretty much all I had for constraints. The other thing I wanted to talk to you guys about today was motion paths. So before we go on, does anybody have any questions about any of the stuff that I went over? All right. So motion paths, also good for controlling cameras and other assorted stuff in your scene. Basically, it creates it's going to take a curve and move an object along said curve. So in this case, I am just going to make a completely random shape here, and it's going to be really ugly and amazing. So this is actually good. So it's kind of cool because you can use motion paths. If you know any Mash, you can use this same curve to like populate this with Mash stuff. And then basically move something along it. So it would be really good, again, for like populating a roller coaster, and then also having your camera follow exactly that path the roller coaster is taking, stuff like that. So I'm just going to make a cone because it's really easy to see which direction it's pointing. I'm going to hide the rest of this nonsense in the scene. I'm just going to delete the rest of this nonsense. All right. So basically, ways like how to actually set up a motion path. So it's also a different it's basically a type of constraint. So select your curve, select your object, and if you go to Constrain, and there's a little option for motion paths. Basically what you want to do is just attach the motion path. There's a few different settings, I'll go over that in a sec, but you can see that what it's done is snapped my sad cone onto this curve, and if I scrub through my time slider, it's going to follow that curve, and you can see a little bit that it's sort of like changing the rotation of the object depending on how it's moving over the curve. So it's going to be pretty helpful for like fine-tune controlling your animations. If I shift the curve around, the object is still going to follow that path. So again, it's really nice for sort of easy editing of things as you work instead of having to go back and like rekey 8 values for like this whole area. Just change your path a little bit and then the object will follow it. So again, there's a few different settings in the time slider, or I'm sorry, in the motion path options. So the time range is basically saying where do you want this motion to occur. So time slider is whatever you have viewable in your time slider. It's going to put a key on the beginning and on the end of that, and it's just going to move it from one side of your curve to the other. If I, say, look at 200 frames of this, you can see that once it hits frame 120, it's pretty much stopped. And that's, again, just because it's set up with the time slider. If you want to define a specific start and end point, you can just, you can do a specific start point only with start or start and end and specify them individually. And then there's also some settings down here, kind of similar to the orientation or like the axis control on the aim constraint. So we can make the cone point in a different direction if we want to. Before we get to that really quick, because I do want the cone sort of pointing along the curve, if you need to access your motion path keys at all, select on the object that is moving across the path, in this case the cone, go into your inputs in the channel box, and you'll notice there is a little blob for motion path. Little blob for motion path. So basically this moves it along the curve in a way that I kind of interpret as like percentage. So this U value is basically like distance or like percentage of the curve length that it's traveled, if that makes sense. So you can see at frame 1, it's not gone at the curve at all, it's just barely starting out, and at frame 120, it's all the way at the other end. And then if you look between that, you can see that value is sort of shifting depending on the time slider and location. So you can treat these keyframes the same way you can normally. So if I wanted to be like, all right, this is actually going to go until frame 180, you can just shift that around normally. You can also go in and add other values for the U value. So I can be like, all right, this is going to, I have no idea what this is going to do to the animation, probably something completely horrifying. So you can kind of control the motion along the path of this. So I can say, all right, that's actually really convoluted. Kind of, what if I put this on frame 1 and this on frame 8? Haha. So you can have stuff go back and forth if you want to. So I set a keyframe. It goes from 0 to 0.8 to 0.1 to 1. So it should go most of the way along the curve, stop, go most of the way back, and then actually go to the end. So that's basically how you control your object on the motion path itself. It's like relatively self-explanatory, and then you also have control over like the front twist, up twist, and some other things you can control if you need to, you know, modify the rotation of your object, and maybe it's doing something a little weird with a default rotation. So all of these are also keyable. Any questions on that so far? All right. So cool other stuff you can do with motion paths. Actually, okay, hang on. I'm going to where am I going? All right, sorry. So I did mention I wanted the cone to sort of point at the graph. So what I'm going to do is just play with the different front axes of this. So I'm basically just going to say, all right, right now it's the x-axis. I probably want it to be the y. And I'm going to just, wait, what is it? All right, it's yelling at me because it's already attached to a motion path. So it's been a hot minute, and okay, cool. Yeah, so silly way that I detach objects from motion paths is you'll notice like once it's attached, so right now it's going along the motion path, anything that's controlled by that motion path has this little yellow line next to it. If you just right click on those attributes and do break connections, it basically will leave it where it is in space, but it's also going to take it off the motion path, so if you scrub back and forth, it's not going to travel along that path. In this case, I'm just going to go ahead and zero out my object, and then try this again with the sort of front axis set to y instead of x. What have I done? That was weird. Okay. And see if that makes any difference. So you, again, pretty much just like, what do you... Shame on you. Wait for it. All right. I might just do a sketchy thing and cheat and delete my original thing. I'm not gonna lie, I very, very rarely use motion paths for anything, and I usually just Control Z them immediately if I've set them up wrong. But anywho, so yes, you can see that now the cone is sort of pointing along the curve, and basically you could use this again if you wanted like a paper airplane or something like that. It would be a really easy way to animate the motion of that. And then just sort of, depending on what direction you want stuff pointing, twiddle with these values until you get what you want and expect. Any questions on that? All right. So there is one or two other sort of cool things that you can do. You can turn on what's called ghosting. And if you look in, so that's actually just in the animation menu. I was in rigging previously. But in the animation menu, there is this tab for visualize. With your object selected, you can do ghost selected. And basically what this is going to do, again, there's more settings for it, but you can preview basically where this object is in space and time as it goes along its animation. So in this case, it's basically showing 3 frames ahead of where the actual object is and 3 frames behind it. If you go, again, into Visualize and go Select, it'll pull up the settings. You can go in and tweak. So Global Preferences is grabbing settings if you go into like your Windows setting, Preferences menu. You can override that with custom frame ranges. So this would be, I only want it to display frames 1, 10, and 20. Or select your object, hit Apply. So you can see, again, it's only doing frames 1, 10, 20. If I add like 150 in there and to apply, it's going to dump a little ghosted object there. You can also, the ones I find more helpful are custom frame steps, I think. Yes. So this one is going to be how many little ghosts do you want, or like how many previews do you want before that point in animation. So I could set this to be maybe like 10. And steps after, same difference. So I'll hit apply for that, and you can see that we now have a lot more little ghosts before. Is that a question?
Yeah. What do these look like in the render?
They don't render.
They don't render?
Yeah. So this is purely like an animation sort of help guide, or that's not a word. Aid. Say again?
It's just kind of like onion skinning in a way.
I guess, yeah. But it's like NURBS curves, if you've ever tried to render them. They don't actually render, so a lot of times they'll use these as a visual way of looking at how fast is my object moving. So if all of these little ghosts are like really, really close together, like you can see kind of right at the beginning, they're pretty much lumped so closely together that it almost looks like a solid object. And then, again, like the farther away they go, it's kind of like a visual aid, again, of speed. You can also use this if, once you get into rigging, there's like IKF Switch, which is a whole thing. But if you can use it for like trying to line up objects. So like for that little ball we were picking up, you could turn on ghosting and say, all right, so here is exactly how my ball moved from like frame 1 to 2, or like between these 2 points. And I can use that to sort of like nudge the ball back into place and like match the correct rotation with that little ghosted preview. So it's really, like, honestly, I always forget about it, but like it would be super helpful for certain stuff. Or again, if you wanted to like make sure that your object is colliding with another object at a specific point in time, you can use ghosting to help you do that. Does that make sense? Sweet. Any other questions? All right. But yeah, so that is basically those settings. And then the step size is kind of like that by frame in your render settings. So right now, with it set to 1, it's going to show you preview every frame. If I set this to 4, it's going to show me 10 previews, but this is going to be every 4th frame away from my animation. So depending on what you want, how many ghosts you want to see, you can set these up differently. But those are like, if I'm doing ghosting, usually the only settings that I kind of care about. So I'm just going to go ahead and close that. If you ever want to unghost an object, just select said object, go to Visualize, and do Unghost Selected, and it'll get rid of those. So again, it's not going to hurt anything having them there. They won't render anything like that. Any questions on any of that? All right. So really quick, I'm going to show you guys how to set up since all this week is pretty much all about sort of camera movements, I'll show you guys how to set up like a weird camera rig with this motion path. So I'm just going to make like a sad series of cubes that we can focus on. And I'm just going to go ahead and make a new camera. And that's not a camera. What am I doing? All right, and I'm just going to group that camera. I like having extra control of my camera, so I'm going to attach the group to the motion path and not the camera itself. Again, I just like that little extra bit of control. So again, select your group, select your curve, and go to Constraint, Motion Paths, and attach to Motion Path. And this is probably going to be real janky with my settings, I would imagine. So what I would like is, so theoretically I'm shooting for this camera pointing along this path instead of sort of off into who knows what. And this is, again, just sort of how I set up the motion path. So I'm going to try front axis X again and just reapply that motion. Oh, don't give me that. And just reapply that motion path. So that's actually still a terrible direction. So we can undo that and try front axis of Z. And that does something. That's at least perhaps pointing the wrong direction, but it is at least following the path in the way that I expect. So you'll notice if I go and I go into that new camera I've made and I sort of scrub along it, you can't really tell what the heck is happening because there's nothing in my scene, but you can kind of see maybe that it's like following the motion path. So again, really good if you want to do like roller coaster animations, stuff like that. What you can do, which is even more powerful, is sort of combine this with an aim constraint. So I'm going to go out of here because it's a little nauseating. I'm just going to grab my camera and just throw another group on this. Again, I like having control of my camera, so I'm going to aim constrain this particular group. So in this case, I want the camera to be pointing at the boxes. So I'm going to grab the box, shift select that little group that's on top of my camera. And this is not the one that I've attached to the motion path, this is a new one. And then I'm going to go and do constrain and aim. And I do not want maintain offset, and I'm just going to hit apply and see what happens. Apparently nothing super magical. So again, this is probably one of those instances where you're going to need to play with like the aim vectors a little bit. Because in this case, this is very clearly not pointing at that little cube that I want it to be pointing at. So I'm just going to undo that and try the X vector. That's also pointing the wrong direction. I feel like at this point I should just try Z, and because that was all right. All right. So you can also actually, someone asked me yesterday, I think it is the Z that I'm looking for because it looks like that's sort of lined up. The camera's just pointing the opposite direction. So you can actually enter, oh, I see, because I also have this set to 1. Yes, so it is indeed Z. You can actually set this, if it's facing the wrong direction, to a negative value. And since the camera was originally pointing away from the cube, if I set that to -1, you can see the camera is now actually pointing at the cube. Weird thing that like someone asked me yesterday, and I was like, I don't know, let's try it, and it worked, and I was very excited. So anywho, if I look through this camera now, camera 1, you can see that no matter where I scrub, it's still following the motion path, but it's also, oh god, example of horrible whippy camera motion you should probably try to avoid. But it's now actually looking at the cube the entire time. So something like this would be really, really good if you're doing something where you're like flying through a scene and like swapping back and forth between looking at different characters. In which case you could constrain basically each character as a driver for that aim constraint and key the weights. So like from frames 1 to 10, it would look at character A. From the next few frames, it would look at character B, etc. But there's a bunch of different ways that all of this stuff can sort of be combined into one for use in either animation or like animating cameras that are all, in my opinion, quite lovely and delightful and useful. And the beauty of this particular setup is, again, if I wanted to this is going to be weird, changing the curve while I'm in the camera on the curve. What? But again, so this is basically set up in a way where no matter what I do to this curve, and no matter where I move, oh god. No matter, okay. No matter what I do to that curve or where I move that cube, the camera is always going to stay on that curve path looking at that cube. So it's a fairly modular way to animate a camera, where you don't need to go out and just sort of be like, oops, I moved my cube. Looks like I need to change the rotation values of every frame I keyed my camera on, which always sucks. So that's pretty much motion paths and sort of aim constraints and combining them for moving cameras. And that's actually basically all I had for you guys. So are there any questions on that? Anything else, assignments, etc.? All right, in that case, be free.